So, welcome everyone, and today we are very, very happy today to have a very um, empowering presence of a very young scholar from Gateway House with us at Middle East Insights program. Her name is Charuta Ghadyalpatil, and she is a research assistant at Gateway House, Mumbai. She graduated from St. Stephen's College, University of Delhi, with a master's in history and has previously worked with Art Deco Mumbai, a heritage conservation nonprofit where she managed the archive and conducted research on urban history. Her research interest lies in maritime history, India's northeast, and political geography. Something which really enamored me towards having her in board with us was the fact that she wrote about the global south recently. And it is a very engaging article which we will share along with the podcast. And with that, there are a couple of questions I want her to further ruminate on it and discuss because mostly the ideology of what exactly is a global south is very muddled. Different scholars
Right.
have different identities and ideologies regarding what the global south is. So, my first question to Charuta is that how would you define global south in today's geopolitical context?
I would, so the starting point for it would be, and the logic of it is largely economic, that it's a wide spectrum of countries that are largely lower or middle income. Most of them run the trajectory from developing to least developed. And in terms of where they are on the globe, they're across Asia, Africa, the Pacific, and Latin America. It's a lot of them, a majority of them, in fact, used to be colonies at some point, and they were part of concurrently occurring, parallelly unfolding anti-colonial struggles. And uh, and the economic logic of it, that if these countries are deprived, the idea is that they are deprived because of the way their history went, because
Yeah.
they were part of a global colonial order of capital, and the deprivation and the long-standing inequality that defines them comes from a fact of history. So there is the very strong, the way we define it would be a socioeconomic way, but that doesn't entirely explain why the term catches on at all the points in time it does. And for that, you have to take into account the geopolitical context of it. So currently, what makes it take, and what has led to a resurgence, say, since the pandemic in 2020, has been that, starting with the pandemic, and then the war in Ukraine, and more recently the war in West Asia, all of these have exposed vulnerabilities in these economies. They've exposed them to further shocks and long-term debt crises and hangovers that come from that might not even be specifically linked to the pandemic, might be older, but inequalities in terms of health, access to healthcare, access to resources that you need to build up uh, industrial bases or manufacturing bases. And parallelly, these are also countries that are the most vulnerable to climate emergence, to the climate
Yeah.
crisis,
Yeah.
to impacts of climate change. And the sort of the in those terms, the political unifying idea for these countries is that a lot of times they have been implicated, they've been entangled in crises that are not necessarily of their own making. And climate change is among the prime examples of it, that the countries that stand to the countries that are the most vulnerable and are going to be impacted the most aren't necessarily the ones that contributed the most to it. So
Yeah.
that is a general sense of what makes up for the global south.
So, when we talk about this power asymmetry, is that why you use the term that the meaning of global south is uniquely amorphous in the discourse of international relations?
Kind of, yes. It's amorphous because it's not the same as defining a state, a country, or even a continent. There isn't a It's not geographically coherent. The logic of it isn't based on how the Earth works or how the globe works.
Yeah.
The dividing line isn't something like the equator, where we know for sure that things change above and below the equator. Um, so it's hard to pin down, and even though we might intuitively know what a global south country is or what the global south is, the logic of it becomes hard to sustain after a point, because sim- simply because it's such a huge group that in itself it carries contradictions, that
Yeah.
all of these countries don't necessarily agree on all geopolitical issues. All of them, even though they might agree that climate crisis needs to be addressed first, they might not agree on the best way to do it or the quickest way to do it. The priorities might differ. Um, Also, finally, it doesn't help that the global south and the third world, which I know I'm sure we'll come to, they're both negative definitions. They're more defined by what they're not rather than what they are. So, the southern countries are, they're not exactly poor, or they're not all poor, but they're not exactly rich. They're not industrialized, or they're not necessarily post-industrial. They're not exactly developed, but we don't know where on the development spectrum they stand. So it's not bounded. There's nothing to coherently unify all of these countries, and that's why it's amorphous. Something like the West Asian countries, the oil-fed West Asian countries, who, when the idea of a global South was coming about, were very much a part of it, and they do still see themselves as a part of it. But they don't necessarily qualify in terms of where their economies are, or in terms of just political stability, and also in how they act in multilateral organizations. For instance, uh, they have typically negotiated as a separate bloc rather than as a bloc of the global south.
It's very true, specifically West Asia as a concept. Iran and Turkey, for example, they are not in the Indian External Affairs Ministry in the West Asia department
Right.
as
Yes.
such.
Yeah.
So there's so much of confusion about the nomenclature and what it means in the larger spectrum of things and how we see. But there's always been this, be it scientific Darwinism or be it colonialism or be it neoliberalism, there's always been this white man's burden of trying to strangulate or trying to put us in our place, whichever place they
Hmm.
designate us to be. So, my other question now comes to that in your article, you have defined the term nation um, uh, instead of states when you're referring to global south. So, why do you use the word nations and not states?
I'm coming at it. I'm coming at the nation, at any nation in the global south, as again a fact of history that, while their foundations might not necessarily be the same as European nationalism, where as it existed in from the 17th century or more, or the more modern form in the 18th and 19th ones, and a lot of the colonies that are now nations had their borders delimited in extremely violent and
Yes.
culturally unaware ways. But in spite of that, I'm using nation as a scale of analysis, as a scale of academic analysis, because however many confusions there may be, or however many fights there may be about borders and about what is the correct bounded geography of a nation, a nation is still how we organize and conduct global politics, how global governance is managed. It's the order of, in terms of the order of who gets a say at the table, for instance, or whose responsibility it is to amass and then distribute resources. It's still a nation that is doing that. And I just, in this context, or especially in the context of the article, I just as well use the two interchangeably, or use it as a hyphenated nation states, where the foundation is that of nationalism of at some point, but state as, the political community that organizes this.
No, it's very true because, again, why shouldn't we use it in interchangeable terminologies? Because we do not have to follow the diktat of the global north. At the
Okay.
same time, but there are so many other scholars like specifically of Latin America, even from India, like Yogendra Yadav, who say that instead of the term nation state for India, we should use the terminology of state nation. But coming to my next question, according to you, what led to the origin of the Brandt report?
So this was the Brandt report. It came out of the Brandt Commission, or this independent commission on international developmental issues. It was formed in 1977 by the World Bank, and the idea was that the 70s had not been economically very good for most of the world collectively, and for different countries at varying points in time. There was the oil crisis. There was
Yeah.
record unemployment and inflation, and there was also a sense of the monetary order that was fashioned at Bretton Woods in the IMF and the World Bank was not living up to its potential, was not doing as well as its founders would like it to do. So the idea with the Brandt Commission, which was headed by the former Chancellor of West Germany, Willy Brandt, hence the name. The idea was to identify what led to this stagnation in growth, both for the global north and for countries of the south, and see if there was a way to, if not completely rehaul, if there was a way to tweak the existing architecture of global governance or monetary governance to further distribute and accelerate growth and resources across all countries. So it had representations, equal representations from developing and the developed world. India, in fact, sent an economist, L.K. Jha, who used to be the governor of the RBI in India. And then he went on, and he was also secretary in the Commerce and Finance Ministry. So he was part of the Brandt Commission. And the commission came out with two reports, one in 1980 and another in 1983. And what both of these reports agreed on was that there was a wide gulf in terms of standard of living between countries in the north and countries in the south. And the way it visualized this was through a line that ran through the globe, dividing all of these economies in terms of where they stood in on the GDP or the GDP per capita scale. So just visually, it ran through the Gulf of Mexico, through the Mediterranean, and through China, and then it looped down in Asia to leave out Japan, New Zealand, and Australia. So ensconcing Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Pacific into south. And it did attempt to also explain where this inequality came from, but on that note, it didn't. Nothing it said was original. It was largely borrowing from, and it was in conversation with what countries of the South had been saying through the UN or through other bodies like the non-aligned movement, or by then what they'd formed of the G77, and the recommendations as well, the ones it made, a lot of them still stand and are still a demand that the countries in the South push for, like greater representation at the IMF, making lending and borrowing easier, enabling technology and resource transfer from the North to the South, to then enable countries in Africa and Asia to stabilize, to grow, so that they could do their own bargaining at these multilateral institutions. So it's and at the point at which it came out in 1980 and in 83, it was acknowledged by countries, by the developing world. The 83 report, the second part of it, was part of the conversation in India at the non-aligned movement summit we hosted in 1983. But beyond that, after about the next 6 or 8 months after they'd both come out, they sort of fell to the wayside. The reforms, to the critics, the reforms were both too radical, but not radical enough. But they were at the same time proposing a lot, but not doing a whole lot of change on that front. And also the countries that would be required to do the most, in this case, the US or the EU, they were caught up in domestic, well, not necessarily domestic, but they were caught up in the Cold War. The EU was having the former, what became the EU, was having a particularly rough patch in the European Economic Community negotiations. The US was by then caught up in the Iranian Revolution and Soviet invasion in Afghanistan. So all of those things sort of took over uh, the imagination and took over the news cycle, took over what was happening, and made pushing for reforms as a single unit that much more difficult at the UN or at the World Bank or the IMF. And the report kind of died its own death.
That is, I mean, like 70s when Saudi Arabia had the oil embargo and
Yes,
most of the West was completely jeopardized. Then in 1980 to 88, the Iran-Iraq War, 79, the Iranian Revolution,
absolutely. Yes.
first Gulf War in 90s, in the 91, and all of this along with the Soviet invasion after that, the American invasion of Afghanistan and all of it, again, too much of what I see that with the role of IMF and especially the socio-economic context that you talk about, it's a subtle way of projecting the power of the dollar and still continuing to do so when it comes
Very much
to
so.
all
Very
of
much.
that.
Yeah.
So, one thing which I don't understand, Charuta, is that even before I was born, which was way ahead of when you were, but the point is that the world has always been, this terminology of first world, second world, third world. So,
Right.
can you please tell me what is third world and why did this concept arise?
So the third world came from the term came from this French demographer, anthropologist, and he did a bit of history as well, Alfred Sauvy. He wrote a paper in 1952 called, and I'm translating, called Three Worlds, One Planet. His point of reference was pre revolutionary France, which was divided, which was socially stratified into three estates. That was the first estate, which is the clergy, which
Ah,
has which has the most access to property, money, and also royal power. Then there's the nobility, which is landed, and again they have, which is the bulk of knights and knighted community. And the third estate is everybody else.
yeah.
It's the middle classes. It's right down to the farmers and the peasants. And that was his idea for the third world. That if the first world is the US led West, and the second world is the communist bloc or the Soviet bloc. The third world is all of these other miscellaneous countries, all of whom coincidentally at this point were through the 50s, 60s, were gaining their independence from empires of Britain, the Dutch, the French empires. In some cases, they were they were breaking out of US intervention in
Yeah.
the case of Central and Latin American countries. And and in his imagination, like the third estate demanded out of the French Revolution, the third world could potentially also demand equality, or its foundation lay in solidarity among colonies, in solidarity among like these cosmopolitan discourses of anti-colonialism. That was his idea. And once he wrote that, there were a series of other writings and other writers who built on that in through the
Hmm.
60s and 70s. And it really took hold because this is the time that both decolonization as a political force and as a theoretical exploration was in the air. Post-colonial critiques of empire were also in the air. The Ghanaian president, for instance, he'd already spoken of in his campaigning at the League of Nations and generally within Africa, he'd already spoken of European countries of the North reducing the South to a subservient position. So it really took off after he wrote it. And parallelly, in 1955, there was the African Nation Conference, or the Bandung Conference in Indonesia, which at during which these 29 countries specifically spelled out their solidarity with anti-colonial movements. And a lot of these countries in greater numbers met some years later in Serbia at the non-aligned summit, which was the first of its kind. And this was specifically countries whose main concern was to diffuse the bipolarity of the Cold War so that they could focus on developmental issues that were very, very serious at that point for them. And about 3 years after the non-aligned summit, 77 of these countries came together as the Group of 77 to negotiate better at the UN for what it was that the third world needed. So think of all of these things is happening in conversation with each other. So we wrote it, and it took off because Paris at that time was the hub of a lot of intellectual activity, and people borrowed from it, people built on it, and and when it came to this third world, it met with existing feelings of and existing work on anti-colonialism, on imperialism and imperial capital, and it came together as a political identity in the third world, and the third world acted through these platforms it created for itself through the G77 or the non-aligned movement.